You good to go, Zach? Perfect. This is a much heartier crowd than I expected. I thought with the forecast and the rain that's falling, this would be a be a different turnout this evening. So thank you so much for joining us. This is the second in our 7-part speaker series about George Washington and American memory. And the goal of this series is to explore the many dimensions of George Washington and how he's been remembered in the United States over the past really 2.5 centuries. If you missed the first talk in the series with author Michael Haddam and executive director of Old North Illuminated, Nikki Stewart, that's available on the Cambridge Public Library's Cambridge Room YouTube channel. And in that talk, Haddam and Stewart shared their insights into the American Revolution and its memory very broadly in conversation with History Cambridge's Beth Folsom. As for this evening, I'm Chris Beagan. I'm the site manager of Longfellow House, Washington's headquarters National Historic Site. And on behalf of our partners and the National Park Service, I am very pleased to welcome you here this evening. We've been fortunate to work with the crew here at the Cambridge Public Library, History Cambridge, the Cambridge Historical Commission, and the Cambridge 250th Committee to organize this series. So we have some folks in the room here with us tonight, and we also have some folks joining us remotely online, so welcome to all of you. We all also share our gratitude to America's National Parks for their sponsorship of this speaker series, including tonight's event. And I should say that America's National Parks isn't quite what it sounds like. They're a nonprofit partner of the National Park Service, which operates the bookstores that are at national park units across the country. And in return for that, they provide some financial aid to the national park system. So while this speaker series looks at George Washington really broadly, tonight we're here to talk about Washington and Cambridge specifically. And you might think, Washington and Cambridge, wasn't that a long time ago? I can't think of anything that might possibly remain from his time here, except for your favorite National Historic Site, Longfellow House, Washington's headquarters. But Washington is really all around us in Cambridge here. Of course, there's Fort Washington Park down in the port. There are several Cambridge streets named for Washington. There's Washington Ave on Avon Hill. There's Washington Court in Central Square. There's Washington Street down in the port. There's, of course, the Washington Gate on the Cambridge Common. There's the Washington Elms Housing Complex, which is operated by the Cambridge Housing Authority. There's a Washington Tower in Mount Auburn Cemetery, which I think might technically be in Watertown, if anyone knows, but I know Canterbridgians claim Mount Auburn Cemetery. There's all sorts of places that sort of bear the mark of Washington, and then there are even more that bear the memory of the Continental Army and Washington's time here. So I'm sure you can think of many. I'm sure our presenters will share others with us as the evening goes on. And so this evening, we're very lucky to have with us two incredible presenters to explore much more about Washington and Cambridge. J.L. Bell is the author of The Road to Concord, How 4 Stolen Cannon Ignited the Revolutionary War. He's also the proprietor of the Revolutionary Era history website, boston1775.net, and perhaps most importantly for this evening, the author of a voluminous 650-page special history study for the National Park Service all about Washington's 9.5 months in Cambridge. We're also joined this evening by Charles Sullivan, who is the author of Building Old Cambridge, Architecture and Development, as well as a photographic history of Cambridge. And since 1974, Charles has been the executive director of the Cambridge Historical Commission. And I can comfortably say that I don't think there is anyone on this planet who knows as much about the built environment in Cambridge as Charlie. So this evening, JL is going to kick us off by sharing a brief history of Washington's time in Cambridge in the 1700s, before he passes it off to Charlie to talk a little bit about the memory of Washington, particularly through the lens of the Washington Elm on the Cambridge Common. And then after, we'll dive into some conversation. And we'd very much like to take your questions tonight. So as JL and Charlie move through their talks, please gather your questions. If you're watching on Zoom, you can pop them right into the chat window, and Zach will collect them for us. And if you're here in the room, please keep them at the top of mind so when we get to the conversation portion, we can we can have a nice conversation. And with that, I'll pass it off to JL to kick us off.
Thank you. Thank you to Chris, and thank you to all of you for coming. I'm going to start by talking about why was George Washington in Cambridge. They asked me to talk about the background. That's the fundamental question. But I'm going to really focus first, why Cambridge? And that starts with the way the war started. On April 19th, 1775, 2 British columns marched through Cambridge on the way to Concord. The initial expedition and the reinforcement. And then the local militia companies mustered in Cambridge and elsewhere. Civilians emptied out of town in a panic, expecting the Redcoats would be coming back, as they did. Indeed, the worst fighting of the day was in Menotomy, or West Cambridge, which is now Arlington. The provincial companies set up a stand to block the bridge across the Charles River from Cambridge. If they had done that successfully, then they would have stalled the British withdrawal really close to the center of Cambridge and to the college. And as it turned out, that didn't happen because Earl Percy, the commander of the expedition at this point, the man in charge of the reinforcements, he was really into maps. This is actually a map that was recently discovered at his family seat in Britain, a hand-drawn map. And it showed how he took, before getting to central Cambridge, he took this turnoff to Charlestown, and he got all his troops safely onto the Charlestown Peninsula. That meant that a lot of the pursuing militia companies ended up sort of washing up on the shore in Cambridge, as close as they could come to the British without risking that crossing over into Charlestown. And the leaders of those militia units chasing the British were also in Cambridge, and they ended up at this house, the Hastings House, the home of the steward who looked after Harvard College, Jonathan Hastings. Dr. Joseph Warren and the Massachusetts Committee of Safety were there by the evening of April 19th, and the next day, General Artemus Ward joined them to be the commander of this army. There is now a stone on the campus of Harvard Law School. The last time I was there, it was surrounded by that orange construction fencing that they do to keep you away from it, but I'm sure it will be visible again shortly. The militiamen coming into Cambridge, they found, well, a lot of houses that had been emptied out because the Tories had left earlier in the preceding months. They found Christ Church, the church of those loyalists, empty. They found that the Harvard dorms were empty. So they found places to sleep, sort of stuffing themselves 150 men at a time into some of those mansions. Now, there were also troops down at the bottom of this map in Roxbury, which was quickly fortified, and that was facing the only land bridge from Boston at the time, the Boston Neck. That area was soon commanded by a man named General John Thomas from Plymouth, and really in the first weeks of the war, it was operating sort of semi-independently from General Ward up in Cambridge. By May, those New England militia companies had become legally an army. Men signed up to stay and fight for the rest of the year. The first actions of the war took place on the northern end of the siege lines. There was a fight off Chelsea, and then there was the big Battle of Bunker Hill, which left the British holding another peninsula. And that made the area to the west of that peninsula even more important, i.e. it made East Cambridge and West Charlestown, what is now Somerville, very important. And all those developments solidified Cambridge as the center of the New England Army. Next question, why was George Washington in Cambridge? Well, why George Washington? The 13 colonies were all represented at the Second Continental Congress, but New England, which is represented here on this map in just as a blob of yellow, they wanted support from the other colonies. So they conceived of a strategy of pushing for a Virginia commander and for Southern troops, which would commit the other parts of the North American colonies to the war. Young Washington here, he had experience commanding the Virginia Regiment in the 1750s. He was, in fact, got praise, or at least press, on both sides of the Atlantic for his actions during Braddock's retreat and other events. Now, there are other American military men, or men with military experience, like Artemus Ward, who was also a colonel during the previous war, Israel Putnam, Richard Gridley, and there were also in the American colonies at this time retired British officers with a great deal of professional experience, Charles Lee and Horatio Gates. But Washington was the political choice because he had value as a Virginian, as a native of America, as a very wealthy man who was already politically committed to opposing Crown policies, and he showed up at Independence Hall wearing his new uniform, the uniform of the independent militia companies of Virginia. There was even a rumor previously that he had promised to pay for an entire regiment on his own to march up and rescue Boston if it were attacked. This was false, but it sort of cemented in people's minds the idea that he was a man who put his fortune behind this cause. He was put on, the Continental Congress put him on nearly every military committee during the spring of 1775. He was in charge of this, he was in charge of that, and then eventually when it came time in June to decide, are we going to accept this army as our own, are we going to support it financially, legally, politically, and are we going to choose a commander for it? Well, the delegates chose George Washington unanimously. At the same time as by adopting the army, the Continental Congress also turned this New England army of troops from Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, and Connecticut, turned them all into the Continental Army. Another way of looking at this question, why was George Washington in Cambridge, was what did Washington think his job was? What was his mission? Why did he come here? And he thought that his job was to push the British out of Boston and Charlestown using force, possibly bringing on a second battle of the Bunker Hill, another very costly battle, whether it was a win or a loss for the British, something that convinced the ministers in London that it would just be too costly to continue this war. And of course, a big battle would also bring glory to Washington's name, and that was rather important for him at the time. As the months dragged on and he was here in his headquarters with no apparent progress, Washington began to get nervous. Was he doing his job? Was Congress becoming impatient with him? And he kept coming up with plans to attack Boston. He went even so far as to propose an attack by soldiers across the ice when the shallow parts on either side of the neck were frozen over in the winter. This would have been disastrous. Those plans were never going to work. He eventually acknowledged that they weren't going to work. All the other generals whom he had to consult with, they almost unanimously voted him down, every one of his plans. On one plan, General Nathaniel Greene said, maybe it might work. Everything else, no. General Ward finally convinced Washington to try fortifying Dorchester Heights. And this operation in early March 1776 was a major feat of planning and logistics, skills that Washington had learned. That position threatened the British in Boston, and it threatened the supply lines, which were even more important, the shipping in and out of Boston Harbor to this town. And so General William Howe finally decided to sail away in March 1776. Now, General Howe had actually been wishing to leave Boston since the summer of 1775, after he had survived the Battle of Bunker Hill. He thought that this region was not going to be conquered. He thought that the military, it was just going to be too difficult to get off this peninsula and onto the mainland. He proposed this to the British ministry back in the late summer of 1775, and it just took so long for him to get approval, and then the winter came on. That's the only reason he was staying. Washington had spent months worrying that British would come charging out of Boston and attack his positions and his dwindling army or other things like that, and that just was not going to happen. So another way to look at this question is what actually was the function? What were the results of Washington being in Cambridge? And I think that this is when he got to learn how to be commander-in-chief of the army. And it was actually very beneficial to him that he was not doing this while being chased by the British Army, while the siege lines seemed pretty static. He learned how to manage generals, how to maintain communications and files, how to choose his aides, how to oversee logistics. He learned how to work with the local governments, the Congress, and native allies who came to visit him. He learned how to run intelligence and counterintelligence operations, in part by learning what not to do. I think most important, he learned how to understand the New England troops, including black soldiers, which had been a great surprise and shock to him when he arrived. Washington did not like the army that he found in July 1775 when he arrived in Cambridge, and yet, by the end of that period, when he went south to New York and for the rest of the war, the core of his army continued to be the New England troops. Massachusetts provided more soldiers for the Continental Army than any other colony. His closest officers, people like Henry Knox, Nathaniel Greene, and Benedict Arnold, until that rift in 1780, they were all younger New England troops, New England men. Washington still had lessons to learn after Boston. He had to learn how to handle public health, like smallpox. He had to learn, most importantly, how to outlast the enemy instead of trying to beat them, which he had continued to try to do up really through the Battle of Brandywine in Pennsylvania in 1777. But some of what he learned here in Cambridge was crucial to his ultimate success as a commander, whether he realized that was what the benefit of his months in Cambridge was or not. Now, there's a final way I wanted to leave you with thinking about why was General Washington in Cambridge, which is the question of history writing and popular culture. It ties to the themes of how we remember Washington, which is part of the series here. How did American authors describe Washington in Cambridge, especially how did school textbooks of the 1800s describe Washington in Cambridge? And in that period, in the 19th century, Washington was extremely respected in American culture, to the extent that authors erased his flaws and his learning process, and I've emphasized his learning process during Cambridge. They presented Washington as an indispensable leader, possibly divinely provided. A man in 1844, John Slocum, who, writing in the voice of his father, a Revolutionary War veteran, said, "We were permitted to see face to face the great man who, under God, was destined to achieve the independence of his country and to lay broad and deep the foundation of this stupendous republic." Well, how can you compete with that? If you think of Washington that way, and you think of him coming to Cambridge, that means he had to fix something. He had to make whatever he touched better. And the main thing that 19th century authors said Washington fixed were the troops. The Yankees. Authors almost turned the New England Army back into this disorganized mass of militias. And remember, legally it was an army. Legally, and historically it had fought the Battle of Bunker Hill. Historically it was creating this siege. But they treated this as just a disorganized mass, almost echoing this English caricature of the Yankee Doodles. And Washington came in and he provided these men with discipline and order and top-down authority, not the community-based mobilization which had won the Battle of Lexington and Concord and inflicted such heavy losses at Bunker Hill. That incident, the way Washington came and provided authority, well, visually, culturally, it was represented most by this image of Washington meeting his troops for the first time under the Washington Elm. And to hear a lot more about the Washington Elm, we'll now hear from Charles Sullivan. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, J.L. How do I switch?
Just this button here.
There we
It's
go.
over on this. Furthest.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you, JL. That's a great introduction to why why we're here tonight, why we're continue to be obsessed with George Washington and his experience in Cambridge. So I'm going to talk mostly about the Washington elm, but also about some other manifestations of the veneration that Washington was held in Cambridge. I think it's safe to say that Cambridge people felt that they shared Washington with Virginia as his having resided here for only 9 months, but this was a formative period, a determinative period in the American Revolution. The founding of the American Army, the U.S. Army, can be dated to Washington's taking command here on July 3rd, 1775. The Army itself celebrates the date in April, which was the Congressional, or the American Congress, Continental Congress measure that established an army, but the Army didn't really exist until Washington arrived here, took command, and then the rest is history. So the Washington elm, which in folklore or in reality was the location under which Washington is supposed to have taken command, really became the personification of Washington in Cambridge and in New England. It became a focus for political activity in the pre-Civil War period, and then a focus of tourism in the later 19th century, and then a focus of patriotism in the post-World War II and the Cold War period of the 20th century. So this is just one of many, many, many illustrations showing the elm in its prime, probably looking better than it might have in the 1870s when this image was published. So the Washington elm was located on Cambridge Common, and Cambridge Common was at the center of the town of Cambridge, which at the time of the Revolution included Arlington to the north and Brighton to the south. The village was at what's now Harvard Square. Cambridge Common today is a remnant of the historical common that was essentially what was set aside or left over after the surrounding lands were granted. So in the previous slide, I've showed you a much simpler map of the Boston area, one of the several British military maps of the period. It's important to take care looking at these maps because the British military engineers were cooped up in Boston. They could not reconnoiter on the ground, and several of these maps, including the one that JL showed, are really conjectural when they get beyond inland from the shoreline. But this is one of the better maps for at least showing the shoreline and the relationship between Cambridge in the box there, the village at Cambridge, and Boston on its peninsula. So the common is essentially what was left over after all of the surrounding lands were granted out to the proprietors and the residents of Cambridge. In this image, it's a raggedly shaped, rough rectangle with a number of roads that debouch into it. It's not fenced. It has no boundaries beyond the private fences. The fences around the private properties around the perimeter. It is bounded most definitively on the east side by Harvard College. The village is to the south, that grid of streets, which is not quite accurate, but pretty close. And then along the south side of the common, the T-shaped structure is Christ Church. And then the rectangular sort of walled garden is the Longfellow house. The Washington elm is one of about half a dozen elms that were planted along Garden Street, beginning at the corner of Mason Street and extending up to the corner of Linnean Street. And then where the common until 1724 extended as far as Linnean Street, there was another row of elms along Linnean Street marking the north border of the common. Those elms were planted in the early 18th century, about 1715 or 1720, based on the dendrochronological evidence gathered when the Washington elm was cut up finally when it fell in 1923. The common, as I said, was crossed by roads, but the roads were not bounded. It was the expression of the landscape architect's term of desire lines. There were paths across the common that connected where people wanted to go in varying numbers and densities. The elm is not one of the structures enumerated in the 1781 Harvard undergraduate thesis drawing, but here's the college on the right, Christ Church in the middle at the bottom. Mass Avenue going up to Arlington is going off towards the upper left-hand corner. And then at the far left is a remnant of one of the barracks that were erected on the common during the siege of Boston. So the common looked like this probably on the few dry days of the year. The rest of the time it was a mud pit and difficult to cross. Mass Avenue was characterized at one point in this period as traveling up Mass Avenue towards Arlington was said to be like walking in the bed of a brook. But it did make a bucolic scene in this view from 1809. So the Washington elm was the origins of the story of Washington taking command are a little obscure. There have been arguments ever since about how Washington actually did take command. He arrived in Cambridge. He went to Wadsworth House. He met the officers in command, probably signed an orderly book, and then probably met the troops. Whether he actually was stood under this tree, this random tree on Cambridge Common on July 3rd and took command has always been open to conjecture, but there was certainly folklore in the early 19th century. Veterans of the Revolution were still around. There were people who remembered the Revolution and the siege. There were certainly their children and their grandchildren who had it at first hand from veterans. But the first person to really write it all down, or at least a person of intellectual repute, credentials who took it seriously and wrote about it, was President Edward Everett, or Professor Edward Everett, later president of Harvard College, who made an anniversary oration on the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. And in this oration, he speaks about the taking command. And so that gives credibility to the oral histories, I guess. The common history evolved. In 1830, it was enclosed. It was by act of the state legislature. It was fenced in and surveyed. Its boundaries were delimited. And as you can see in this 1833 map, the common has become a very different place. It's become a park, a public park, not a country place for pasturing and random activities. The elm is here at the corner of Mason Street. It's now outside the fence of the common in the right-of-way, which, and of course, before the entire common was a right-of-way, so the location of the elm didn't make any difference. But now it's in the middle of a street. As you can see here, in the first probably national publicity for the Washington elm in Gleason's Pictorial in 1853, here's where the Washington elm tradition really takes off, as national publications like this began to take notice and talked about Washington first pitched his tent. Nobody believes he pitched his tent here. Drew his sword on the cause of freedom on the 3rd of July, 1775. The tree may possibly have belonged to the primeval forest. Well, no, because there are 6 more planted just like it up the street. And so on. The legend starts to metastasize here. The next journal to pick this up was Ballew's Pictorial in 1775. On July 7th, their edition shows this fictional view of Washington on his white horse surrounded by colonial troops taking charge. Some of the associations that people held popularly are of the Washington elm with American freedom are represented by this, to me, a surprising discovery that at one point Stephen A. Douglas, the senator, Stephen A. Douglas, who was Lincoln's opponent and sparring partner, was hung in effigy, not only on Cambridge Common, but on the public square in Cleveland, in Chicago, in New Haven, in New Bedford, in Auburn, New York. But the Liberator, when William Lloyd Garrison's paper reported on this, they cited the incident in Cambridge in March of 1854, where Senator Douglas was hung in effigy, not only in Chelsea, but in Cambridge on Thursday morning on the Washington elm, with the following inscription: Stephen Arnold Douglas, hanged for treason to freedom, sic semper tyrannis. Well, Arnold is in italics because, of course, to the associations with Benedict Arnold, which probably were, if not were, not meaningful. Another meeting in 1861, almost immediately after the firing on Fort Sumter, city leaders in Cambridge called a meeting specifically at the location of the Washington elm to have a public meeting about the rebellion, the Southern Rebellion, and to organize a community response. Cambridge was sent the first organized unit that responded to President Lincoln's call for volunteers. That grew out of this mass meeting of 3,000 people in April 1861 under the Washington elm. So after the Civil War, the militarism and the jingoism of the Revolutionary period kind of faded away, and the elm becomes a sort of a tourist attraction, a sort of picturesque element of old Cambridge. And this view, published in 1883, by the time this view was published in 1883, the colonial house on the right had long since been torn down, and the Washington elm was not just being surrounded by prairie schooners or wagons like this, but had streetcar tracks on one side and had become a much more of a part of the urban environment of Cambridge. But the romantic view was what brought the tourists. Oops, sorry. There we go. So in 1847, before the city itself took much action, a private citizen paid to fence in the tree. Then in 1861, the city put in its first historic site marker, a granite tombstone-style marker that still stands on Cambridge Common today. You can trace the history of this neighborhood through the many, many, many photographs of the tree. In this one, about 1868, the colonial house that was on the corner to the left in this view has disappeared. You can see there's another equally large elm tree behind this one. And then if you look closely, you can see at least two more disappearing up Garden Street behind the Massachusetts Arsenal, which is the hip roof building behind those two cone-shaped evergreen trees on the right. Very soon thereafter, the First Church Congregational gets erected in 1870. The tree is beginning to be pruned. If you look closely at these, you can see that the unpruned nature of the tree, and a couple of years later, the branches are diminishing. The dead branches are being cut back. As early as the 1850s, the Boston papers are saying that the tree is dying and needs to be cared for, and the city Cambridge responds periodically and sends crews out to cut back the dead branches. But the tree soldiered on, so to speak. At the centennial, it was decorated with this archway in the common, and then a sort of I don't know, a scrim or something with George on his horse, General Washington on his horse, mounted on the tree for the centennial, which was a huge tourist event, not so much in Cambridge as in Lexington and Concord, but certainly we had the crowds here too. The Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia in 1876 attracted artisans and craftsmen, manufacturers, and the like from around the country. Cambridge's official contribution was this replica book that was carved by a Cambridgeport craftsman from a piece of the Washington elm. It's from the city of Cambridge, 1876, Washington elm, Cambridge, Mass, under this tree, blah, blah, blah. After it was returned from Philadelphia, the city council voted to give this to the Harvard Library, which had this at the Fog on display not too long ago. Began to see the Washington elm spread in popular culture. There's a whole spread of souvenirs, and one of the earliest is this Eastlake style folding chair with a tapestry back that is a representation of the Washington elm. At one point I thought I had the photograph from which this tapestry must have been copied, but that might have been taken a little too far, but it's identifiably the Washington elm. This turned up in an auction in Cambridge about 25 or 30 years ago, and now in the collection of History Cambridge. Oops. The real fuel that supercharged the Washington elm tradition was the publication of this book in 1876. The Cambridge of 1776, wherein is set forth an account of the town, et cetera, et cetera. It was written sort of in the style of the 18th century by Mary Williams Greeley, a young woman in Cambridge, edited by Arthur Gilman, who was a founder of Radcliffe College. Among other things that it said, today he formally took command under one of the grand old elms on the common. It was a magnificent sight. The majestic figure of the general mounted upon his horse beneath the wide-spreading branches of the patriarch tree, the multitude thronging on the plain around, the houses filled with interested spectators of the scene, while the air rang with shouts of enthusiastic welcome as he drew his sword and thus declared himself the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. This was published and republished. It became nationally known, and it cemented the Washington elm legend in the popular culture. The souvenir era took off in this period. People came and wrote home about taking a leaf home or taking a twig. This fragment of wood ended up at the Maine Historical Society. The Longfellow house has these objects. One of them just a piece of bark. Another one a turned cup. Chunk of wood. There were souvenir postcards and stereo views by the hundreds that just kept coming and coming. Some of these objects are here. You can come up afterward and you can see the chair. You can see a table in the collection of Alyssa Pacey. You can see a few objects, including one just received by Alyssa from Vicki Drucker, whose great-grandparents owned the Brattle Street Inn at 34 Brattle Street. She just turned in a terrific, sweet little case for a bobbin, all of it fabricated from the droppings of the Washington elm. It's the newspapers reported periodically that large limbs had fallen, and it seems almost that people must have been keeping an eye on the weather, and if there had been a stormy night, they would go down to Garden Street and scavenge pieces of the elm to fabricate into souvenirs. So the elm is really beginning to decline around the turn of the century. You can see it here in 1895, and in 1905 it's noticeably smaller. In the right-hand view, this came from an estate in Tennessee. A family had driven out their car that they called the Greyhound of Nashville, arrived under the Washington elm, having driven cross country in 1905. The tourists still arrived, even in their modern flivvers in the 1920s. The tree is diminishing again in August, mid-August 1923. The Boston papers ran this view and quoted Mayor Quinn of Cambridge to say His Honor is quoted as saying that as far as I am concerned, you may chop it down at any time. Oh, I'm sorry, he adds. This was shocking, and when the tree finally fell, it made the national news. Newspapers across the entire country carried headlines like this. It attracted crowds. People turned out to salvage pieces of the Washington elm. They fought each other. People came down with saws. One newspaper story, probably with tongue-in-cheek, said Radcliffe girls turned out with saws and hatchets to dismantle the tree and salvage fragments of it. So the tree now is a sorry sight. It's about to be removed. It's cut into sections, carted away to storage as crowd tries to grab pieces. And here is the city public works crew with a two-man saw. Actually, it looks like probably a four-man saw here, trying to cut through the fence in November of 1923. The Arnold Arboretum is called in. Sections of the tree are sent over there. The rings are cut. The tree is determined to have been planted between 1713 and 1719 based on account of the rings. This portion of the elm is at Washington's house, Mount Vernon, Virginia, the caption says. But a little bit later, a visitor from Cambridge went to Mount Vernon and said he saw this in the fireplace. So obviously they didn't burn it down. But so pieces of the elm, Mayor Quinn, a very clever politician, a 12-year mayor of Cambridge, decided that the elm could be cut up, that there was such demand for it, he would have it cut up. And so he cut slices off the trunk of the tree and presented a slice to the governor of each state, each of the then 48 states. And so this one is the one that went to Virginia. He had 350 gavels manufactured from pieces of the Washington elm, and those were distributed to both houses of each state legislature, to Masonic lodges, DAR chapters. Practically every public body in the country got a gavel with a suitable label from the Washington elm. And then smaller pieces, and you'll see after we're done, you can come up and see smaller pieces like this with a brass label. Approximately 1,000 smaller pieces were cut up and distributed to members of state legislatures. So this has created a sort of a cottage industry. Apparently there were just random pieces of wood that were being polished up and sold to tourists as part of the Washington elm. Arborists or tree nurseries did a booming business in elm cuttings that were said to be scions of the Washington elm. They almost certainly weren't, according to the Arboretum, which warned against profiteering and deception. So 2 years later, on the sesquicentennial of Lexington and Concord, the Postal Service issued the stamp of Washington taking command in a very unlikely fashion here. And on April 20th, 1925, Vice President Dawes comes and plants a scion of the elm on Cambridge Common. So here's Dawes, whose portrait is in the upper left, and Mayor Quinn, who's has a wonderful smile, is having a great time, is clearly enjoying a joke at Dawes's expense as the tree is planted. This is not a particularly successful operation. Oops, I thought I'm missing a slide here. The scion did not survive and was one of a number of successor trees that were planted. There were people in Cambridge who felt that this still wasn't enough, that there should be more of a monument, a memorial to Washington on the Common in 1925, but nothing happened. And meanwhile, the city was recognizing Washington in other ways. In 1905, a group called the Daughters of the Revolution, not to be confused with the Daughters of the American Revolution. This is a rival group of women who had connections to the Revolution, paid for the Washington Gateway that stands at the southern end of Cambridge Common. The DAR, the Daughters of the American Revolution, countered in 1913 by building this flagstaff and gifting it to the city of Cambridge. But more prominently, a local developer named Nathaniel Shine, who began to develop hotels in Cambridge, developed the Continental Hotel, some of you remember, on Garden Street, the Ambassador Hotel on Kirkland Street, and the Commander Hotel on Garden Street. Designed this building to take advantage of its associations with Washington and the command as commander. And so not only called his hotel the Commander after Washington, but decorated the front with a portico that's a replica of the portico of Mount Vernon. This is still there. It's obscured by the awning that leads you in from the sidewalk, but it is still there, and if you look under the portico, you can see the flushboard appearance of the front of Mount Vernon. The interior of the hotel is decorated with revolutionary themes. Here's the coffee bar with a flight of American troops, or troops of some sort, Hessians maybe, marching on the wall. And as it happens, the Commander Hotel was bought in the midst of the Depression by a guy named Frank A.K. Boland, who was a hotel executive from New York, bought the Commander, moved in, and became fascinated with the legend of Washington taking command. After the end of hostilities in World War II, he proposed that the city's monument in the pavement of Garden Street was no longer proper, that the city should have a proper memorial, and offered to lead the charge to create that. So he commissioned Leonard Kraske, an American sculptor, to create the relief you see on the left of Washington taking command that now hangs in the hotel. He found on the right a copy of a statue by Jean-Antoine Houdon that was taken from life. Houdon visited Washington at Mount Vernon in 1785, went back to France, created this standing statue for the Virginia Capitol. A copy was made by a foundry in Somerville, but the owner never paid for it, so Boland discovered this and installed it at the hotel in 1950. So he's really capitalizing on the associations of the Commander with Washington, and announced plans for a new $400,000 memorial for the Washington Elm that he hoped to have the city fund. In the end, it was $15,000 that paid for this monument that was erected on Cambridge Common in 1950. And the date of this image is incorrect. Frank Boland continued to promote the associations of the Commander with Washington for the rest of his life, had an annual ceremony on Evacuation Day at his monument every day, as long as he could manage. But the political life in Cambridge changed. Washington was no longer a focus by the 1970s. In that period, Cambridge Common was the focus of different kinds of protests against the Vietnam War, against Harvard, the administration of Harvard University. There was vandalism. There was And in the early 1970s, the city decided to rethink the common and created this accumulation, this monument area that includes the relief, the bronze relief that Leonard Krasky did for the Sheraton Commander, 3 cannon that were left behind by the British and then stored at the Cambridge Arsenal until they were given to Cambridge at the time of the Civil War, and the latest iteration of the Washington elm. You can see that's a pretty good representation of an American elm. For many years, there's a whole nother line of stories about the Washington elm that have to do with the scions that were the cuttings that were taken that were planted in various places around the country, and that when Cambridge has died, various scions of the grandchildren of the original tree were brought back. We don't know at this point, it's been so long and there have been so many substitutes of elm trees. Does this have any genetic relationship to the original elm? We have no idea. But it certainly is a beautiful tree, and it's a very credible. No other tree has this vase-shaped shape as the American elm. And then finally, at last, Cambridge's official seal. The first version, when Cambridge became a city in 1846, was designed by Edward Everett of the Oration in 1826. He was then president of Harvard University, and designed the seal on the left with Gore Hall, which was then Harvard's library, on the right in the center of that vignette, and then the State House on the right. In 1896, it was updated. Gore Hall now takes a much bigger prominence, but then there is the Washington elm. So the city is now, as a committee, rethinking and updating, making more relevant, perhaps, to modern life, the city seal, and it remains to be seen whether the Washington elm will remain as the focus of political life in Cambridge. Thank you.
All right. Hello. Hey, is that working? Good, good. I hear much less echo over here than I did over there. So this is excellent. Thank you both for those presentations. The Washington elm is the perfect example because I think it tells us so much more about the memory of the Revolution than it does the events of the Revolution. And in a lot of ways, it's, I think, even tells us more about the Civil War than it does about the Revolutionary War, which is really fascinating to me. I have a couple questions for you, and I hope there are some questions in the audience too. Is there questions percolating? Okay, well, I'll get us started. Today I think, West Cambridge certainly still identifies closely with George Washington, right? Certainly due to his headquarters being on Brattle Street, but Brattle Street is perhaps even better known as Tory Row, because before the Revolution, it was home to, many colonists who stayed loyal to the Crown. And to me, it seems kind of unique that one place has been able to hold on to both of those identities that are essentially at odds with each other, right? The loyalist cause and the patriot cause. And I'm curious to know what you think of, where you think this phenomenon finds its roots, and perhaps what it means for the memory of the American Revolution in the Boston area.
Okay, from the beginning, there was a connection between the Loyalist mansions and Washington in that because the Loyalists all left in September 1774 and subsequent months, that left these very large buildings available for the Provincial Army to move in and then for George Washington to move in. I think that there were many different explanations provided for why Washington chose to move from Wadsworth House on the corner of the Harvard campus where he was first staying for the first few days after he arrived in Cambridge, out to the John Vassall estate. I think one of the reasons, not only was it available, but it was a big estate looking down on the rivers, surrounded by orchards and pastures and farm buildings, and employing enslaved labor. It made him feel at home. That's one reason. Another is that it provided some distance between him and the men who were being stationed in the Harvard College dorms on the Cambridge Common, so that it provided a bit more hierarchy, a bit more distance for him. So I think they were, from the very beginning, some of the things that made that mansion appealing to John Vassall and his wife, who were the richest people in Cambridge, also made it appealing to George Washington and eventually his wife.
Socially, George Washington was very much on a par. I mean, he wasn't as wealthy as the Vassalls, perhaps, but I think he probably considered himself to be their equal. And it's interesting that none of the mansions were destroyed in the during the lead up to the evacuation or after the Loyalists left. The mansions were pretty well protected. They were occupied by the American Army for the most part, and then immediately after Revolution, they were put up for sale. They were confiscated by the Committees of Correspondence, by the Commonwealth actually, and then put up for sale. And a new American aristocracy purchased them. An aristocracy funded by privateering for the most part and currency speculation, but still an aristocracy in the making. And I think that's why all those houses survive today.
And it is impressive that there are so many. I mean, what we consider to be Tory Row, a term that was invented in the 1800s, there's nothing missing. There was, I think, one house moved, but possibly simply because these were very large, attractive, and well-built houses, they have all survived.
Although the Tory mansions east of town, there are 3 or 4 Tory mansions east of the village, that none of which have survived. But all of Tory Row is intact.
Yeah, thank you both. It's sort of a full circle moment for Brattle Street and West Cambridge, absolutely. I also don't mean to put you on the spot with this, but Washington was, of course, in Cambridge in 1775 and 1776 when he was commanding the Continental Army, but he came back to Cambridge later as the first president in 1789. And I'm wondering what his visit to the area, if you know anything about his visit to the area in 1789, tells us about his relationship with Cambridge and his memories of the Revolution.
Washington did indeed come through Cambridge. He was on a tour, or possibly a procession, all the way up to Maine. He was visiting, in his first term, he made a point of visiting all the American states to show himself as president and to meet with people, local dignitaries. So he spent some time in Boston, Cambridge, Marblehead. He went through Cambridge as quickly as possible. He actually chided his honorary guard, Caleb Gibbs, who had been one of his close officers during the war. And he said, surely you would know that I forget exactly what he said, but surely you would know that I like to get up early in the morning and get started. And so Caleb Gibbs and his horse guard had to gallop after Washington to catch up with him. As far as I can tell, looking at the record of that visit, he did not go back to headquarters. He did not have a fondness for this house where he had spent 9 months, including time with his wife. He was there to see the dignitaries. He was there to make time, get all the way up to New Hampshire and Maine, all the way back to his job in New York and Philadelphia.
Sorry about that. Fascinating. I think that says a lot. That like either he was all business or there was something else bubbling under the surface, right? That was certainly, as you talked about, a period of extraordinary growth for Washington. So for me, it's hard to kind of reconcile that he wouldn't have some sentimentality, but maybe that's just who he was as a person. I think it tells us a lot. Mm-hmm. So I'm curious in the audience, any questions bubbling up for you? For John or Charlie? And how about online as well?
Question?
Yeah.
So when George Washington first showed up, and he had all the militia from different fields all over New England, how did he react with them? I've heard that it was very tough for him to get everyone to go as one army.
How did George Washington react to seeing the New England troops, and how did he bring them together? Well, this is something I was talking about, where the idea is that these troops were still undisciplined, disorganized, that they were still a militia, not an army or a collection of militias, and that he provided order and cemented them together. And I think that's an exaggeration. For one thing, legally, they had already been turning themselves into an army, enlisted through the end of the year. They had a structure of the generals, Artemus Ward at the top, General John Thomas, then the other New England generals. All those generals knew what their hierarchy was based on their seniority back in their own colonies. This was the remnants of Puritan New England. It's not an undisciplined place. It is a very disciplined society. And the militia system had been in place for many years. They were experienced in turning themselves into an army when needed for defense, when needed to help the imperial wars. So I think that, in fact, the army was a lot more organized than some of the sources, some of the analyses say. However, there were some differences. One of the major ones is that, and Fred Anderson, the historian, wrote about this for the Massachusetts Historical Review some years ago, that the New England way of looking at war was a covenant. That you, as a soldier, made an agreement with your commanding officer that you would serve under this captain and this colonel in this regiment. You would serve for your colony. You would serve for a particular length of time, and then you would go home. You would do your duty. The authorities would have done their duty to you. The covenant would be fulfilled. Washington had great difficulties figuring out this system and his place in it and how to figure it, because he wanted to shift men from around. I mean, he was getting petitions at headquarters saying, well, we 12 guys, we signed up to serve in this, Captain Honeywell's company, and now they're trying to put us into Captain Thurston's company, and we don't like that. And Washington didn't know what to do with it. He wanted to be able to find places for a good Connecticut man or a good Pennsylvania man came and wanted to be an officer in the army. Where could you put him into the army? Well, none of the New England regiments wanted an officer from outside their state or even outside their county. So those things he had to get used to. And then there was the fact that when he first arrived, he said, this is an exceedingly dirty people. There are old men, boys, Negroes, Indians. He had to figure out what to do with people he did not think were soldiers. In the middle of the fall of 1775, he actually led his councils of war into making the decision to bar black soldiers from re-enlisting in the army, even if they were serving perfectly well, even if they had served very well in some cases. We can see him changing. We can see him growing, becoming more fond of the New England Army and the troops, at least, reversing himself on the question of re-enlisting black soldiers by the end of the year, becoming a little soured on the riflemen who came in the summer of 1775 from Pennsylvania, Virginia, and Maryland, discovering that they were if he thought the New England Army was undisciplined, these guys were totally out of control. So we can see him changing. We can also see somewhat the New England Army changing, but in general, I think it's a little too much of an exaggeration to say that he was coming to impose discipline on it. It was a two-way adjustment.
Yes, I had heard a story that General Washington at the time met in the house of the Cambridge Center for Adult Education with some of the leaders of the First Nation up in Canada, trying to get them to join with them. Do you know anything about that?
there were, over the course of 1775, early 1776, there were many emissaries from various native communities. In fact, there were some soldiers serving in the Massachusetts Army from Stockbridge who were there even before Washington arrived. And then there were basically diplomats coming, checking him out. So yes, at some point, that house, which is now the Cambridge Center for Adult Education, it was owned by a man named William Brattle, who had to flee into Boston in September 1774, and one of his daughters was living there, and she took it upon herself basically to say, okay, to keep this property, I'm going to be friendly with the army that's arriving. She made her house available to the Quartermaster General, Thomas Mifflin. He brought his wife up, or rather his wife came up immediately after she heard that he was spending a lot of time with the ladies. So she comes up from Pennsylvania, and so they had a genteel household of the Mifflins and the owner of the house with two teenage girls that she was looking after. So this was the only house in the area where young officers could meet young women. And it became the social center. And so we read a lot of cases of when Abigail Adams comes to town, when the new Surgeon General and his wife come to town, they talk about having dinner parties at the Mifflin's house. So he was handling a lot of the entertainment, and that included hosting some of these get-togethers with Native American diplomats. There was something called an out-of-doors meeting that probably took place around that area in January 1776. John Adams happened to be in the area on his way, I think, back to Philadelphia. So he participated and wrote about this in his diary as well. Eventually, a lot of these initiatives with the Five Nations, the Haudenosaunee, with other native groups, they were not decided in Cambridge what would happen. But nevertheless, it was significant that Washington was trying to engage in this sort of diplomacy. He saw this as part of his job.
And I'll just add that you're scooping our next talk. So on January 22nd, we'll be right back here talking about Washington's relationships with Native people.
And one of the speakers at that talk, Colin Calloway, is the expert. He is a terrific person. I really recommend you come and hear him.
Yes. You might know him from, if you've been watching Ken Burns' series, The American Revolution. He appears in that series as an expert speaker. And he'll be joined by Cobble Wilkerson, who's a grad student at Harvard's History Department, who is also an enrolled member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation. So it'd be a really interesting conversation on January 22nd. So I hope you'll come back. Other questions?
Hi, I was just wondering about all the monuments you showed us, why people today should care about their preservation and also just making sure they are staying as they is.
Why people should care about the preservation of monuments? Because I think they're associated with really important people and events. They represented a significant investment, financial and emotional investment, and our associations with some of them change. Cambridge has not seen the kind of movement to remove monuments that have taken place in some of the southern cities. We've had a commission that, under the direction of Mayor Simmons a couple of years ago, looked at Cambridge monuments, tried to decide whether it was appropriate that they continue or not. And the decision was that yes, they should, that there are, some of them represent periods of American history that perhaps we might even be ashamed of at this point. But still, with proper interpretation and contextualization, there are opportunities to learn and to teach about periods of American history when attitudes were different. at this point, there hasn't been a movement to remove any current Cambridge monuments. But I'd be interested in your feeling about particular monuments if you have them.
Well, nobody came here to hear me speak. I also agree with you, though, that we should be honoring our history, and even the bad moments in our history hold value to where we are today. So I would agree with you there. Thank you.
I think some sort of commemoration is almost natural, that, you know, in our own lives, if we see something that has been meaningful to us in, you know, our high school and we come by and it's gone, we feel it emotionally. And so I think we're going to have monuments. It's a question of what we have monuments of, what we keep, and how we respect what we do as a culture end up choosing.
I also wonder, I'll add a thought to this, that, you know, as in the long term, the very long term, 250 years, 200 years, you know, as society becomes more literate and more educated and more mobile, I kind of wonder if monuments will continue to be the way we remember collectively, or if there might start to be other ways that we remember, you know, through you know, festivals and gatherings and literature and other ways of kind of transmitting cultural memory. If monuments, and I don't know the answer to this question, I'm not an expert, but if monuments sort of came about in a time when society was different and they were a little bit more of a blunt tool than perhaps we have in our toolbox these days.
We can certainly see the evolution of monuments. One of my favorites is the William Dawes hoofprints on the Common, which are just a completely different quality of public art from the gate next to them, and yet the hoofprints, I think, feel much more personal, much more individual, less monumental in one way. And yet, that's the monument. Another thing I really find very interesting about the way Cambridge has chosen to commemorate the elm is that tombstone is still there, I believe contradicting in terms of the date, the relief, the bronze relief, as to when Washington took command. And so I would find that confusing if I didn't have a guidebook explaining how they relate to each other.
Well, there have been corrective monuments placed. The original monument for the cannon said that they were captured from the British. And in fact, the British had left them behind. Or no, that they had been brought by General Knox from Ticonderoga, and that was just not the case. They were captured and left behind in Boston Harbor. So we do have opportunities to correct the record, but the hoofprints, I can tell you a story about the hoofprints. The descendants of William Dawes approached the city in the lead up to the bicentennial. The Dawes descendants have always been sore that Longfellow immortalized Paul Revere, perhaps beyond his inherent worth, and that perhaps Dawes doesn't rhyme as well as Revere. But in any event, the Dawes descendants felt neglected. They offered the city an equestrian statue of Dawes, who took the route through Roxbury and Brookline, through Harvard Square, and up Mass Avenue towards Arlington and Lexington and Concord. So we had an association with him, but we did not want, and I'm speaking we for the Cambridge Historical Commission, did not want another equestrian statue on Cambridge Commons. So one of our members had the idea of commemorating his ride with footprints in concrete. Well, that wasn't going to work necessarily, so we thought, let's do them in bronze. And then we had this whole sort of theological discussion about how do horses move their legs when they gallop? Do they go, don't, do they go 1, 2, 3, 4? And so one of the commissioners had a niece with a horse out in Lincoln, and on a snowy day, she galloped her horse down a dirt road, and her uncle, who was an architect, took the measurements along the x-axis and the y-axis, developed a pattern, and we had a blacksmith at Old Sturbridge Village give us a colonial-era replica horseshoe, because we didn't want a modern cast steel horseshoe, we wanted a hand-forged horseshoe. We sent that to a bronze foundry, had those hoof prints cast in bronze in reverse, laid out according to how this young woman's horse galloped in 1975.
That's great.
Yeah, and so that's a very different way of commemorating historical events. Yeah, we're very proud of that.
And to give the Dawes family their due, Charles Dawes, who we saw planting one of the replicas of the elm, is a member, a descendant of the greater Dawes family of Boston as well.
Yeah, and the Dawes had an arboretum in Ohio, in Marietta, and they contributed a couple of trees to the common. We were happy to take those.
If I heard you correctly, I heard a couple of references to the Tories fleeing in September of 1774. Can you tell more about that? What happened at that particular time that caused them to leave?
Okay. This is the first 2 chapters of my book, so it's going to be a while. There was something called the powder alarm. On September 1st, 1774, General Gage, the commander of the troops in Boston and the royal governor of Massachusetts, sent troops out to what is now Powder House Square in Somerville, that stone tower. That was a gunpowder storage house. And he had troops take the gunpowder from that storage house to bring it into Boston where it would be safe from the potential rebels. He also sent a small troop into Cambridge to do the same thing with 2 small cannon that the Cambridge militia used. That provoked people in Cambridge seeing red-coated soldiers arriving in the town. They got upset, but they couldn't do anything about it. In the afternoon in Boston, they discovered a letter that had been sent to General Gage telling him that there was this powder that might be disappearing from the powder house in Somerville. That letter was signed by William Brattle. I mentioned William Brattle before. By that evening, he was out of there because he had heard that people were going to be coming after him. And indeed, the evening of September 1st, locals went to William Brattle's house, and when they didn't find him there, they went further out to Attorney General Jonathan Sewell's house, also along what is now called Tory Row, and were yelling. And he had gone into Boston as well, so they couldn't do anything. Eventually, his wife came out and offered them some wine if they just would go away, and so they did. But meanwhile, rumors of what had happened in Cambridge were spreading west and were getting worse. So that by the next morning, people in places like Marlborough were hearing that there had been a second Boston massacre, that the soldiers had not only come out to take the weapons, but had killed people. And then the rumors got even worse and worse, so that by the time they got out into the center of Massachusetts, down into Connecticut, the rumors were saying that the Royal Navy had shelled Boston, and the whole town was in flames. This caused a militia uprising. This caused 5,000 men with their guns to start marching towards Cambridge and Boston. And as they came, on the 2nd of September, 1774, as they came closer, they realized, okay, we're not seeing smoke on the horizon. We're not seeing streams of refugees coming our way. They left their guns behind. They still came massed on the common and demanded that all the royal officials in town, all the men who had been appointed to the council, all the judges, the royal sheriff, come and either resign, promise not to act under the new Massachusetts Government Act from London, or simply apologize for what they had done under orders from General Gage. This was called the powder alarm. It took place on September 2nd, 1774. It convinced the people along Tory Row, some of whom were these officials, like Jonathan Sewell and Charles Lee, who lived in what is now History Cambridge, that this was no longer safe, and they started to move out. John Vassall, He was not a royal official. But a couple of days before all this happened, he had written a letter to the royal governor saying, my uncle says he doesn't want to be on the council, but I'll be on the council. And so he also realized, okay, they're going after my brother-in-law, the lieutenant governor, out at what is now Elmwood. They might hear about me. They're going after my uncle, Joseph Lee. He left that house in September 1774. Everybody who could leave in those Tory mansions left. One man, Ruggles, George Ruggles, he made a deal with a man who wanted to get out of Boston, Thomas Fairweather, and they switched properties. And that is why it is the Ruggles Fairweather house along Tory Row, now in private hands, because that was the one house of the set that was not still owned by a loyalist family when the war came. It was owned by Thomas Fairweather, and that was the one that was not confiscated. So really, I argue that from September 1774 on, all of Massachusetts, except for Boston, and very briefly a part of Marshfield, was independent of British control.
Quick follow-up about British control. It sounds like a finite moment in time where the Tories just this is probably a broad question, but how much, after the Tories left Tory Row, how much of their influence remained institutionally at Harvard, people that stayed behind?
I would say they never had much influence at Harvard. Harvard was founded by the Puritan establishment to create Puritan ministers. It was a Congregationalist theological seminary. It was by the 1700s, about 2/3 or more of its graduates were not going into the ministry, but that was still one of its main functions. For that reason, they were very suspicious when Cambridge got an Episcopal or Anglican church, Christ Church, right next to Harvard. And then an Anglican minister named East Apthorpe came back, actually, he'd grown up in Boston, came back to Cambridge to be the minister of that church. And he was he came from an immensely wealthy family, like some of these, the loyalists along Brattle Street. His family owned slave labor plantations in the Caribbean. So he had enough money as a young man to build a magnificent house for himself. And people looked at them and said, okay, Anglican minister coming into Cambridge, building a house. This is a bishop's palace. And you can see political cartoons from the 1760s complaining about the British establishment trying to impose a bishop on Massachusetts and going straight to the heart of the Puritan establishment where Harvard College was and putting their church and their palace right next door. And East Apthorpe, the minister, looked around after a couple of years and thought, I'm immensely rich. I don't need this trouble. And he moved to England, and he had a perfectly happy life as a minister in England, and that house has now become part of Harvard College. The other loyalist families in Cambridge supported the church, but when the revolution came, when those families left, so did the minister. And so the church building was actually used as barracks at times. And it took decades before an Anglican or Episcopal minister came back to that building. So really there was, it wasn't until the 19th century at best that the Episcopal Church became associated with the New England establishment at all. It was, in fact, the establishment was anti-Anglican.
At Christ Church, when they give tours, they mention that Washington, being Anglican himself, had the services there on Christmas of 1774, and they point out a pew and say, George Washington slept here.
As I understand the story, it was New Year's that they wanted, and it was Martha Washington wanted a service. And so they found an aide to General Charles Lee, a man named William Palfrey, who he had been a business associate of John Hancock. He was very well respected among the Boston business community. He was an Anglican. He had actually been to London. He had seen the king at one point. He was the closest they had to an Episcopal or an Anglican. And so he figured out from the Book of Common Prayer how to do a service for Mrs. Washington. He wrote about this. And yes, Christchurch is one of the places where Washington and Martha Washington worshipped on New Year's 1776. He also, we know, Washington attended some of the, at least one sermon by a local congregational minister, probably in the First Parish Church of the time. So Washington was very good about attending church when he was away from home. He saw it as his duty as a gentleman and a visitor, and so he, if you look at his diaries, when he goes elsewhere, he will go to different churches, he will show respect. When he's at home, he goes to church about once every 6 weeks and spends the other Sundays hunting.
So maybe just one more question, because I'm conscious of the time here.
Well, I have a question about the elm.
And I think we have maybe a couple online as well, but yes, go ahead.
I'm really intrigued by the veneration of the tree and the relics and the gavels, and I wonder how unique was that? Is that something that happened a lot, so to speak, with historic sites and trees and buildings, or was it sort of specific to the Washington elm? Do you know of other, are there other, notable trees that were in the United States, in America that were?
Yeah, well, Boston Common had notable trees.
There's the Charter Oak in Connecticut, but that's the
yeah.
only one that I can think of that got anywhere close to the Washington elm by the late 1800s was being seen as a national symbol.
Exactly.
It's not just a local one. Now, part of, we are very fortunate to be here in Cambridge, which is the center of the American intellectual universe. It's having this university, having authors, having publishers. It does help to make the local traditions into national traditions. So quite possibly there are trees elsewhere which the communities love just as much, but which don't have the press that the Washington elm got.
I think coming to mind for me also is the Emancipation Oak in Hampton, Virginia, which was the site of the first Southern reading of the Emancipation Proclamation during the Civil War. So that's another tree. It still stands, so it's not, been turned into relics in the same way, but it is certainly a site of pilgrimage, and it's, I believe, please don't quote me, but on the campus of Hampton University, which is a historically black college. So really, beloved tree in that community, but also across the nation.
I think people gravitate to trees if they're out in the landscape. You look to them for shade or protection from the weather, or just something to lean against, and then something happens. And so you create historical associations with trees. And I think there are many trees around the country and around the world probably that are commemorated locally. What's different about the Washington elm is that its associations with Washington, the founding of the Republic, the founding of the American Army, its presence in the intellectual capital of the Western world, and so on. Yeah.
So I get the sense we have a couple online. Are we okay to keep going, by the way?
Yeah, I think we have time for one or two more.
Okay.
So we've had a couple questions that are sort of coalescing around Martha Washington and what her experience was like here. I mean, you mentioned how she came up after George. Could you talk a little more about that?
Martha Washington arrived at the headquarters in December 1775 and stayed through April when she left just a few days before her husband. At Mount Vernon, that fall of 1775, the Governor Dunmore was trying to keep order, and one of the ways he was doing it as the royal governor was offering freedom sanctuary to runaway slaves. And there was a great fear among the Virginia planters that he would attack their plantations, that he would incite rebellions by the enslaved people. People were actually flocking to him. There was a great anxiety we can see in General Washington's letters home that Dunmore would try to attack Mount Vernon, and he was afraid that Martha would need to flee. He was trying to figure out where she could find safety. She was fine. From her letters, she was going to stick where she was. She was not going to leave. She was not going to run away, that is. On the other hand, she was, it seems, quite eager to come and spend time with him. And so after only in November, when it was not just a matter of fleeing, it was a matter of coming and spending time with George, that she came with her son, Jack, Jack's wife, some other relatives, and they all traveled together through Pennsylvania, through New York, up to Cambridge. This set a pattern that was very significant, that Martha Washington spent every winter of the war with her husband from then on. That biographers had estimated that half the time in those years of the war, she was either with him or trying to get to him or sending back home. So she actually, in some ways, went to war as well. Now, she had a very different experience. She was at the house. She was sharing George's room, probably upstairs. She was seeing the wives of other generals. Horatio Gates's wife, Elizabeth, came with her. They would spend time with Mrs. Mifflin, with the wife of the Surgeon General, with other women who were behind the lines. She received visiting clergymen and things like that. So this was really the first time that she was sort of taking a political position, and it really was most evident when she came through Philadelphia, and there was as I recall, there was some sort of dispute about how to honor her. Should there be a ball, or was a ball something frivolous and expensive at this time of war? And she managed that just delicately, excellently. And she managed to say, oh, it would be lovely to have a ball, but we mustn't do it. Thank you so much. I'm so honored by what you're saying, but we really shouldn't. She managed to keep everybody happy. She was really, for the first time, showing up as a public official's wife. And so this was a significant trip for her. She had never been so far north before. She had probably never traveled so far before. And she would take on and maintain this stature as the great man's wife for the rest of his life.
Thank you. And I think we have one more. Is there a story around the naming of the apartment complex Washington Elms? And do you know that story, if so?
Was the second federally funded public housing project in New England after one in Boston. It started in 1936, and I think and then the project after that is Newtown Court. I think the impetus was really, again, Cambridge feeling itself to be exceptional, a pioneer in a new field of public housing, of social housing, and wanting to reach back to some historical association. It's pretty remote when you think of it today, actually, but I think that was the motivation.
Can we have one more round of applause?
So before we wrap up, let me make a shameless plug to please join us on January 22nd for our talk with Colin Calloway and Cobble Wilkerson. If there are folks in the audience or online who are J.L. Bell fans in particular, he also has a couple of talks coming up at the Longfellow House. The first talk is to commemorate the 250th anniversary of Henry Knox's visit to Cambridge headquarters. So that'll be on January 29th. J.L. Bell will be presenting this talk. That's really looking at the role that Knox's artillery played in the end of the siege of Boston. And then in honor of the 250th anniversary of Evacuation Day, he'll be back on March 19th to look a little bit beyond the end of the siege of Boston to the shift towards independence that was happening. So both of those are upcoming. This is a sneak peek. They're actually not even on our website yet, but I know there's fans in the audience, so I hope you'll join us. And I just want to say thank you again to JL and Charlie for joining us this evening, for your extraordinary insights, for your presentations, and to the audience for your conversation. This was a really rich evening for me. I've been excited about this for a long time, so exceeded my expectations. So thank you all for joining us, and please travel safely. Who knows what it's like out there. Oh yeah, and please, maybe what's the best way, Alyssa? Maybe use the ramp to come up to check out the relics of the Washington elm, and I'll move the table out of the way.